Awesome. Morning, everyone. You have access to food now, even if it's 10 degrees warmer. So thanks for joining. Okay. So biblical texts, both from the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, have been deployed at various historical moments and in diverse contexts to argue for a variety of approaches to money. So to take a single set of very recent examples, contemporary Christians use biblical texts to justify a wide variety of financial practices and theological positions that do great harm or great good, from the Christian economics of Christian Reconstructionists who argue for libertarian economics in a Christian theocracy, to the prosperity gospel, in which often very wealthy preachers teach that wealth comes as a divine reward, to neo-monastic movements, which have a common purse and pool financial resources and make communal financial decisions. So when you hear texts like "you cannot serve God and mammon," or "it's easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich person to enter the kingdom," these are quoted aphoristically by persons thinking about money, whether Christian or not, over vast swaths of history. So those deployments of biblical citation are worth studying in their own context. What does it mean that Lenin writes on the parables, for example, or that Zizek seems to really like the Apostle Paul? But while some of these citations offer better or worse historical readings, they're offering interpretations of New Testament texts that need contextualization for the moment of their deployment. And some of these uses also take on material form. And I do a lot with material stuff, so I just want to show you this. This is a checkbook cover that cites Philippians 4:13. I can do everything through him who gives me strength. What does it mean to put this on your checkbook cover? Like, you are saying something about your confidence that, like, there's no check I can write that God can't help me cash, right? There's something said in the materiality of a checkbook cover like this. So, but the texts of the New Testament are as a set of literature from the turn of the Common Era, need to be contextualized within their own material, social, economic, geographic, and theological context. And I hope my presentation today just does some initial work in that for you. This probably goes without saying, but biblical texts do not offer a singular, straightforward philosophy of money, because the Bible doesn't speak with a single voice about just about anything. So rather, the New Testament, which are the texts of my area of focus as a historian, are diverse in terms of genre, authorship, and location, arising from the context of the Roman Empire and the Jewish diaspora in and around the end of the Second Temple in Jerusalem and its destruction in 70 CE. I would even argue that you can't even describe a clear-cut Pauline philosophy of money, because the letters of Paul, so a set of 7 letters written by a Jewish Christ follower sometime in the mid-first century of the Common Era, are occasional letters. They're written to specific communities in different cities spread out over the Mediterranean. There are, of course, other letters in the New Testament attributed to Paul, but likely written in later generations by folks trying to address the issues of their own communities. So just as you don't write the same email to your faculty colleague as to your dean, so too do these letters reflect shifting circumstances and audiences. They are, however, excellent sources for thinking about money, as the mundane disagreements and day-to-day logistics of small gatherings in the first century CE that offer communal meals, read scripture, debate its interpretation, and pool resources for various forms of mutual aid mean that many of these mundane day-to-day logistics involve money. There are, however, a few common elements to these contexts from which this diverse ancient literature emerges, and I think would be relevant to a lot of us in our time periods. And these elements help to read some of the texts, which are often quoted aphoristically for particular arguments about money. So I think it also might help us notice some things that might be relevant to many of us working on this volume. So for today, I'm going to introduce some of that data about the common shared ancient context that would have informed how communities that produced and circulated the text of the New Testament would have understood their relationship to money. Then I'm briefly going to expand on 3 texts which demonstrate some of the range and diversity of thinking about what you do with money in the New Testament. So one caveat at the outset, of course, folks think that of the New Testament or early Christianity in a text like Matthew 6:24, you cannot serve God and mammon, and think that the New Testament treats money as anathema. Or others think that the Apostle Paul, who has imminent worries about the timeline for Jesus's return, is modeling some sort of physical spiritual dualism that rejects earthly concerns, including money. The former statement would rely on a single aphoristic quote over the preponderance of financial themes throughout the Gospels or the other texts of the New Testament. The latter kind of reading isn't bad, but it reflects later readings of Paul that mostly come to us through Augustine and others, so it's anachronistic. In fact, the opposite of true is true. The economy and theology are deeply intertwined in the ancient world, and this deeply affects how both money is understood and also how money is thought about in the text of the New Testament. So in my first book, I call these entanglements theoeconomics. So I'm going to start by turning to some of these common elements that I would raise for us that affect the context from which this diverse set of literature emerges. Gods are understood as economic actors in the ancient world. This reflects the reality of the ancient world. Gods are intimately involved with the economy at every level. But this is true for Jews, so-called pagans, and Christians. All understood theology and economy as deeply intertwined. They transacted with their deities, and they understood the gods as involved. So our modern dichotomy of these categories, theology, economics, how we kind of structure ourselves in different departments is a modern one. So when I say gods are understood as economic actors, what do I mean? Temples often serve as banks. They do currency exchange. Gods are parties in legal contracts. Property is often stored or collected in the names of deities. The sacrificial system, as we've already talked about, is an economic and transactional system. Humans also act as divine human intermediaries or brokers to do the God's business in the world. So I think this context is super important if you're reading any text, particularly religious texts, at the turn to the Common Era. Second, the texts of the New Testament are texts from, by, and for members of the 99% in a time of vast income inequality. This is a rare window into philosophy, theology, and thinking about money from non-elites. This is one of the reasons I think it's important to be careful about what we read alongside New Testament texts, particularly for themes around money, and that we also look at material and archaeological evidence. Last but not least, the texts of the New Testament, which do address money, are constrained by the existing systems of the ancient economy, even as they sometimes imagine alternatives within these constraints. So realities such as the slaveholding economy, extractive systems, vast income and wealth inequality, exploitation, military occupation, taxation, et cetera, are all realities that affect how these texts imagine what the world could look like, even as sometimes you see little hints of alternatives to that. I do a lot with material culture and archaeology in my work, and to introduce these first 2 points, I'd like to show you some examples of these entanglements that I think are really interesting and show you how the gods are active in the ancient world. So this is a view looking towards the ancient Mycale, not the tall stuff. That's from a basilica marketplace in Philippi. And 2 of my text examples are from the letter to the Philippians today. All right, so I'd like to start with some places you might be surprised to find money. Maybe you're not, since you all do nice, really old stuff. But first we can think about the economies of cultic sites in antiquity. Gods and goddesses often own significant property. The properties range from temples, sacred lands, which could be cultivated or leased, votive offerings, to the income and costs associated with sacrificial cult. All of this, of course, requires management, oversight. Temples also serve as banking and storage centers in antiquity and sometimes offer loans. So my first example is a 1st century BCE inscription on the back of a white marble epistographic stele, which is really a fancy way of saying a stone with writing on both sides. And the inscription is recording the responsibilities of some appointees, which include how to distribute temple income and goods in a kind of annual audit of sacred storage for the goddess Aphrodite Pontia. And it says the appointees shall be in charge of the keys of the storage containers, open them together with the priestess each year. Half of the sum belongs to the priestess. The other half they shall send to the public bank where it is put into the account which the goddess has, and they shall record the transaction in the public archive. The money shall be available for construction work as the ecclesia decides and for repair of the sanctuary. This, I think, tells us several important things about temple economies. So first, the goddess owns property. but humans oversee its use and distribution. The distribution is overseen by these appointees and the priestess. Second, I find this always endlessly fascinating. Aphrodite Pontia has her own bank account, right? It's her bank account. This is actually not unusual. Throughout Greece and Asia Minor, we have at least 25 examples where temples are clients or proprietors of banks, and currency is always, of course, changing hands at temples. Third, Aphrodite shares half of the goods in these storage containers with the priestess in an example of kind of human divine profit sharing. So the priestess gets her income every year from this annual inventory. And perhaps most importantly, the inscription describes how both individuals and communities function as intermediaries and agents of divine business in the world. So the priestess and the prostestai manage the inventory and some of the banking responsibilities. The goddess also has decisions made for her by an ecclesia, and a kind of democratic, deliberative assembly. This is a word that you often find in the New Testament, talk about these early Christ-following communities, and which eventually becomes translated towards the church, right? So you have communities making decisions as well. We also find divine images, now turning to coin specifically, were deployed on coinage, weights and measurements, so the means and standards for much of commercial activity in antiquity. And here I'm quoting Mark Schell, coins, which are among the first widely produced publications and reproductions in history, were icons with a value at once spiritual and material, or aesthetic and economic. So issuing authorities themselves, and so the emperors frequently represent themselves as gods or sons of gods on their coin issues. This is just taking a single example. We could talk about coins endlessly. But to talk about divinization issues, this covers a wide chronological range from Tiberius through Constantius II. And there's relatively standardized imagery and ideology. While the popularity of the imperial cult with its various temples, priests, and cultic bureaucracies varies widely within the Roman Empire, depending on where you are, imperial divinization was represented throughout the empire on coins. So you often include inscriptions such as div, dv, divo, or consecratio. And just a quick look at the Roman Empire database from the American Numismatic Society reveals 288 types with divo, 270 with consecratio, 55 with dv, and 20 with div. The earliest types, as I said, are from the early 30s, and the latest types perhaps go as late as 361. Interestingly, most of these issues are small denominational bronzes, including sestertii during the imperial period, numi starting with the denominational reforms of Constantine. So divinized imperial figures are nearly ubiquitous on ancient Roman imperial coinage. Imperial divinization coinage represents a particular ideological arc, but of course, gods and goddesses, other theological imagery are found on almost all Greek and Roman issue coins. City, provincial, and other imperial issues use divine imagery to invoke local deities at the place of issue, express issuing authorities' virtues such as piety, and intertwine a divinity's authority with that of the issuer. Because this divine human interaction occurs on the medium by which these transactions are conducted, the theological and political claims are suffused throughout local economies. There's a really great example from Philippi of a kind of centuriation coin, and it's got like toga people with the oxen in front of them and the plow to like set up the centuriation process and give it kind of divine imprimatur. We also find religion and activity really common in commercial sites, which we can find money and the gods physically interacting all the time. And this is especially true at Mycella, which is where fish and sacrificial meat are sold. And I had that image at the beginning with the view towards it. Mycella very often have space dedicated to cult, so often Mercury, Hermes, and the gods are often invoked when regulating transactions. So this example comes from a limestone statue base in Philippi. Again, where my text examples are going to come from Philippians. And this Latin inscription dates from the 1st century BC. Consecrated to Mercury, Augustus, Sextus Satres Pudens, son of Caius, et cetera, Adel for the Philippians, Adel part's a little uncertain, erected this altar out of false measures for the bronze weights. What the heck does that mean? So we're at the site of commercial activity for Philippi. A Roman magistrate sets up a votive to Mercury Augustus, so this hybridized Mercury plus Augustus, as a site of confiscation or false measures. So this statue base likely held a bronze statue representing equitas, so equity, and the statue was made by melting down the false measures that were confiscated in the Mikelon. So like if they confiscated them, they melted them down and they set up the statue to equity. So the medium of exchange with which a person might purchase grain or oil was not separate from the watchful eyes of imperial and theological authority. The weights used to regulate financial transactions also often depict both imperial figures and divinities. So weight standards in use from the 1st century CE well into the Byzantine period often take the form of busts of emperors, empresses, or deities. This is an example probably of Nero from the mid-1st century CE. So these busts hang from steel yards, which are marked bars along which the weight could slide to help the proper measure. And buyers and sellers both rely upon the embodiment of a deity or semi-divine imperial figure to set the standard by which accurate and proper measurements occurred. And this is exactly the type of weight when the wrong weight, when falsely counterfeited, would get confiscated, melted down, and turned into a statue of equity. So we see all of these entanglements of money, measurement standards, imperial authority, theological authority, etc. So this votive statue provides evidence of the overlap of bureaucracy, imperial cult, and a divinity associated with commercial activity and the proper use of money. So you invoke a divine figure on an object used to complete a financial transaction. By invoking Mercury Augustus and celebrating the confiscations of false measures, it suggests that Mercury Augustus is overseeing what goes on in the Mikelon. And the dedication of a statue to the emperor's equity literally reforms any false measurements that happen to be confiscated. So in a center of commercial activity, deities, imperial authorities appear both on money and on the objects which commemorate and oversee transactions you might do with money as human economic actors are intermingling. So the gods are understood as active not only within temple economies, but also participating in the larger economy, even in spaces we moderns might understand as solely commercial. So I have a whole chapter in my book with examples of this. If people are interested, I can tell you more in the question and answer period. But I think these few examples highlight the inseparability of money from the divine in this period, and that this is all deeply entangled as well in the bureaucratic functioning of cultic sites. So, all right, now moving to some texts. So I hope that doing this shows you that to understand the kind of context of theological and economic entanglements in the ancient world, it requires looking not just at literary evidence, we also have to situate the New Testament materially in order to understand not just the context, but the communities which produced, circulated, and remixed and reused them. This is especially important when we turn to these entanglements in the New Testament. As I've said, the earliest followers of Christ were members of the 99% to echo the Occupy Wall Street movement. Very often biblical scholars just read literary sources. They absolutely should read literary sources, but sometimes they only read literary sources. To take a single example, we talked about this a bit yesterday, there's been 5 books in the last 10 years on Kari, skiffed grace language. Like it's a big thing right now in my field. Most biblical scholars writing on this, such as Paul Barclay or Thomas Blanton, read a text from Seneca called De Beneficiis to think what Paul might have been thinking about with the language of gift. This is really important work. The problem, of course, is Seneca is a super wealthy, super elite philosopher who's literally an advisor to the emperor. I think this is a little like asking Jeff Bezos about Amazon unionization. It's really on topic. It is, but it's not necessarily the same perspective that some of these earliest members of communities in Christ might have, which included enslaved persons, laborers, and tradespeople. So even as the texts I'm about to share with you are not doing huge philosophizing about what the nature of money is, like a lot of our other conversations, I think they are a window into what some non-elites are doing with and thinking about money. So I'm gonna take 2 texts from the Pauline corpus. We'll look at 2 passages from Philippians, probably written in the mid-50s CE, to this community in Philippi. And the second is ascribed to Paul, but likely comes from slightly later generations, 2nd Thessalonians, perhaps just a few decades later. So let's start with Philippians. This letter has language, all kinds of financial language: venture, gain, loss, security, deposit, success. And I would like to take seriously, as we're reading this, all the stuff we just thought about, like that people would have had a vibrant range of possibility of interacting with the deity in mind. So here's my translation. I give thanks because of your venture, that's how I'm translating koinonia here, and the gospel from the first day until now. I have confidence in this, that the one who began a good work in you will complete it by the day of Jesus Christ. Even as it's right for me to think about this way about all of you, because I have you in my heart, both in my imprisonment and my defense and warranty of the gospel, since you are my joint shareholders in grace. That's the soon koinonia. So here, Paul is describing himself, this is the reason for the traditional Thanksgiving, as being in a koinonia in the gospel with the Philippians. So often in like Bibles, you find this translated as fellowship or sharing. But if you look at everyday evidence from inscriptions and documents, it becomes clear that there's some more financial valences from it. Julian Ojero, building on J.P. Sampley, did a philological study demonstrating that koinonia cognates essentially express the idea of partnership of some kind. It's found in economic, political, marital partnership agreements. So basically, you almost always find them in contracts where some money is at stake, contractual agreements. So Paul's stated reason is, I'm grateful for your koinonia from the gospel in the first day until now. So using this term, I'd say the gospel is described as a venture in which both potential liability and potential reward are shared. So the Philippians are joint invested, they're participants from the first day until now. So to kind of give an example of what this might look like in a land lease contract, this is a business land lease agreement from 132 CE, and two people are going to go in on a field together. So after I pay you half of the tribute that's imposed or shall be imposed, I share with you equally all the expenditures, fees, labor, all other costs. Let the koinonia be effective. This is really typical. You find like lots of these types of things in the ancient world. This is an agreement detailing both shared liability and the object of investment. So it's the land here, as well as a sense of the timing. Here's when we're going to do stuff by. So I'm not necessarily saying Philippians 1:5 is a formal contract, but this pairing of koinonia language with a date would remind the Philippians of like, we're in this thing together. We have both joint investment in this thing together. And it also might have reminded them of the stuff they might have signed for, or had someone sign for when they were doing some like leasing for land or other kinds of contracts they might have entered into. Philippians 1:5-7 also includes a kind of chronological component, which I think here brings in the divine involvement. So I'm confident that the one who began a good work in you will complete it by the day of Jesus Christ. Presumably that one is God, like God started the work and it's due by the day of Christ Jesus. So the Philippians is this shareholding agreement of the gospel. If this community thing is something we're mutually invested in, it's not just Paul and the Philippians involved. We have a divine figure, God, as the instigator of the work, and Paul's kind of the absentee site supervisor, is expressing confidence. This will all get done on time. And the day of Christ is kind of described as a deadline for completion. It's clear the chronological references bind the verses together. Paul has had a koinonia with the Philippians. The relationship is still active in the present, and this is guaranteed continuation into the future with an agreed upon completion date. So the Philippians themselves are this side of productivity that's expected to bear fruit for the gospel. It's difficult to underestimate how important this koinonia language is in the letter. It appears 6 times, compared with only 2 occurrences of ecclesia, which you'd see more often in other letters like 1 Corinthians. Anna Miller, in describing ecclesia in her book Corinthian Democracy, writes, Paul's rhetorical aim is marked by rhetorical tactics drawn from a robust discourse of democracy. This ancient Christian community was constructed, at least rhetorically, as a civic and political body. So ecclesia discourse, when used by Christ followers in Corinth, marks a community as a civic political body. Great. But I think the discourse of koinonia instead imagines a financially bound body. We have a divine human financial and theological entanglement that includes Philippians, Paul as co-writer Timothy, Epaphroditus, the Philippians sent back and forth to aid Paul, Christ, and God. So there's this mutual contractual thing called the gospel, overseen by God, due by the day of Christ, to which everybody has to contribute and have a share in. And this community, despite its poverty, it's perhaps the poorest early Christ community that Paul writes with, understands itself as getting a full share in the divine human project of the gospel through mutual aid and support of their colleague, Paul, in prison. Because Philippians is an example of prison correspondence. Paul is writing from jail. He's been getting stuff. The Philippians have been sending him support in jail, and he's writing kind of a thank you, but you owed me anyway kind of letter back. And so example of this would be in Philippians 1:12. I want you to know, brothers and sisters, the things that happened to me have happened for the procope, the success, the advancement of the gospel. So if Paul and the Philippians are participating together in this gospel thing, in which you share risk and reward, if the Philippians contribute as a work site of God and by sending money and other support to Paul in prison, Paul is trying to ensure that he is also contributing, right? He might not be contributing because he's in jail. How could he possibly be contributing? But he's actually saying, I'm contributing because I'm in jail, right? My being in jail is a contribution. So here then we also have, let's see. So then Paul's imprisonment in 1:7 here, when he talks about in my imprisonment and my defense and warranty of the gospel. So there you have apologia, defense, and what I'm translating as warranty here, babiosis. It's absolutely legal rhetoric. Most scholars in my field, influenced by Adolf Deisman, read both terms in a kind of formal legal context without any financial overtones. They say an apologia is the defense speech, while the babiosis is as a kind of positive proof claims. The first is right, but babiosis is also an important kind of financial and theological term. Its context is not your like defense speech on trial, but instead belongs to the context of philosophy, oaths, and the language of business. I'm quoting here Angelstadt Hardinger, and means the solidifying or confirmation of promises, statements, or knowledge. There is no forensic usage of the word apart from Philippians 1:7. But where will you find babiosis type language? All over the place. You do in contracts. Here's an example I love. It's from a camel sale. There are tons of camel sales in Antiquity. This happens all the time. So this is an image of it here. It's from 144 CE, and here's the text. I won't read all of it to you, but at the end of the camel contract, here's what the camel looked like. Here's how much I paid for the camel. It says, I shall guarantee with every guarantee of a double invocation of a babiosis. So there's a guarantee the transaction has occurred. She's received the proper price. Camels have been delivered as described. As the seller, she offers a guarantee about the type and quality of the camels and acknowledges receipt of payment. Statibus, as the buyer, is named elsewhere in the contract as responsible for registering the camels and paying any taxes that might be owed. We're thinking about car registration here, I hope. And the contract is written down by a scribe who also witnesses it. So if the Philippians understand the gospel as this koinonia thing, Paul's invocation of a babiosis would probably, I think, better have reminded them of ubiquitous contract language in the ancient world, that he's like, no promise, warranty. I am giving a warranty for this gospel thing. So I think that Paul's reminding the Philippians that he is the one who brought the koinonia and the gospel to them. Paul is brokering God and is able to instigate the guarantee. Paul's responsible for assuring them of the terms of the gospel venture. The Philippians, who've previously partnered with Paul in giving and receiving, and have likely, as I said, sent him support in prison, still owe the fruit of righteousness by the day of Christ Jesus. And as I said, Paul's saying his contribution is coming through his own imprisoned body. But he's also offering his guarantee that through his imprisonment, rather than in spite of it, this is a warranted promise, the gospel will continue to succeed. Now, I would say in this letter, we likely do see money changing hands. The Philippians have been sending Paul aid in prison and are likely going to keep doing so. But we also see some other interesting things. Money is framed as a mutual investment in one part of a divine project. And I think this is super interesting. Paul frames his own imprisoned body as his share in that work. The other text I want to take us to in Philippians is Philippians 3:7-11. Whatever for me was a gain, these things I calculated as a loss on account of Christ. But even more, I calculate all things are a loss on account of the better value of the knowledge of Christ Jesus my Lord, on whose account I counted all things as a loss, and I considered them dung, or there could even be more strongly translated, so that I might gain the prophet Christ. That I find really interesting. in this passage here, Paul has been highlighting two types of things he has in abundance: markers of Jewish status and also knowledge of Christ. In this passage here, he's literally tallying them on a kind of divine accounting sheet in which Paul sets the exchange rate for knowledge of Christ. And at the high rate he sets, only he seems to have enough on hand to make that exchange. This is right after the passage where he says, I'm a Hebrew of Hebrews, circumcised on the 8th day, all the awesome stuff about his biography. And then he says he's going to take all of those gain things, move them over to the loss column in exchange for gaining the prophet Christ. So Paul is tallying all of his reasons for confidence in the flesh into a single gains column, and then he moves them into the loss column. And then he says all of these are losses because of the better value of the knowledge of Christ. And then he counts these former gains as worthless, literally shit, so that he might gain the prophet Christ. And what's really interesting is, so kerdeso, this verb here implies turning a prophet, and Christ is the object of the verb, is the prophet that Paul acquires. So for Paul, getting Christ is profitable, even with the assets which must be exchanged, account to everything. So it's interesting that Christ is figured as an object of investment for whom Paul will exchange everything. So having Christ as what? As commodity, as currency, allows Paul to participate, and we have koinonia here again, in a koinonia with Christ in suffering, and to attain resurrection from the dead. I would highlight this passage is an early example of the commodification of suffering, which is a trend which will only expand and continue in Christianity. Like, how much is your suffering body worth? How much is dying worth? You can put a price tag on that. So this is Philippians. Just to close, I have one last example from 2 Thessalonians, and this is showing some of the kind of afterlives of interpretation. So what does a community a few decades later do with the image of what it requires to have mutual investment and how we make decisions about money together? So this is an often cited passage, 2 Thessalonians 3:10. Even when we were with you, we gave you this command: anyone unwilling to work should not eat. The text has been used to support a variety of political positions, everything from socialism to free market capitalism, including recently to argue for reduction of governmental nutrition, housing, and unemployment programs to support the poor. So in 2017, a US Republican congressman cited this passage to counter the expert testimony from a Jewish anti-hunger group, which was citing Leviticus 19, 9-10, to argue for continued funding for the federal supplemental nutrition program. So the Jewish anti-hunger group cited the Bible, and this Republican congressperson cited this passage back. I would say, though, this passage, taking in its larger ancient context, both within the tradition of Pauline Christ communities and within the letter itself, complicates how you read this verse and whether you could read it related to any kind of welfare programs. There are very few, obviously, so just some contextual stuff, there are few governmental social safety nets in the Roman Empire, and those few that did exist, i.e. The bread dole, tend to benefit those either living in the city of Rome in proximity or privileged with Roman citizenship. Instead, individuals are often creating their own systems of mutual support and aid by organizing in communities, sponsoring from everything from group meals to funerals together. These groups, these Greco-Roman associations, often form around common interests or commitments, from trade groups to organizations dedicated to a particular deity. Participation in these associations was not just by wealthy people, and frequently we find people pooling more meager resources to form these associations, pool aid, and meet their members' needs. By creating financial structures such as either dues or rotating sponsorship of communal meals, even fines if you stepped out of line, associations could offer benefits beyond the means of any individual member. A lot of scholars are doing work situating early Christ-following groups within this broader context of Greco-Roman associations, especially those attached to the Apostle Paul. Second, letters of Paul, as I've already said, are occasional letters. So 2 Thessalonians is purporting to be written by Paul, but it's probably not. And it's not a comprehensive argument about, obviously, governmental obligations to the poor. That is just illegible for that context. Rather, it's tapping into a trope in the Pauline corpus. We could talk more about this in Q&A, about Paul saying he has financial independence from and doesn't need money from the communities see 1 Corinthians 9, well, he's probably also taking money from these communities, i.e. in Philippians. So this invocation of a prior teaching to make a current argument about mutual community obligation should remind us that this is for this particular community. So I think the admonition to exclude those who are unwilling to work from eating takes place in a community which is already in some of this kind of formation, has committed to mutual investment, maybe this kind of koinonia language together. According to John Kloppenborg, this passage reveals the Christ Assembly, like other associations, had an interest in its own solvency, and so devised means to ensure that its costs could be met by regular contribution of dues. So as with other ancient associations, this seems concerned with the expectations of and benefits to Thessalonian Christ followers, especially when some seem unwilling to contribute what is for them a fragile system of mutual care to run. So I can't tell you the specific financial parameters, but this text suggests that the community was considering excluding those who do not contribute to the community for their communal meals. So this passage is not about whether the poor should have the right to eat and live, but rather describes how one ancient Christ-following community organized to ensure that its members had enough to eat when they did gather and could provide mutual aid and support to one another when they were in need. So this is an example of some of the kind of afterlives and missteps you can have when interpreting these texts. So I hope that my complexity about all these texts is my takeaway for you, and to keep thinking about not just the ancient context of these texts, but also to think about kind of later afterlives of interpretations, both to do great harm and also sometimes to do good. So I think with that, yeah, I'm good. I'll be done, and then we'll do Q&A. And thank you all for your time. Hi.
So Jennifer, you did not use the word collegium or collegium.
Yeah.
Was that on purpose? And can I ask why?
Yeah. I would totally use it. I'd be totally fine. It's a bit of a, it's still a bit of an argument about whether koinonia is a good Greek translation of collegia. That's still a little bit of a sticky point. I'm good with that. Not everyone's good with that, but I do think, I think most people would be on board with Greco-Roman associations are totally a great parallel for thinking about these communities. We have all the same hallmarks about, we might have similar financial structures in these communities, including potential fines, et cetera. So, and that you have organization around a common purpose, potentially common even kind of trade stuff. Like if you take some of this, that these early Christ followers are tradespeople in particular areas, that it all fits really well. But the like philological stuff, I try to be a little more careful about because
Yeah, I don't know how you would handle that. Because, I think you're right to be a little bit cautious, but if you can use it, it does open up another set of contexts that could help frame some of that financial language. I don't have advice on what to do.
It's weird. It's like a kind of sticky wicket in biblical studies right now, but it's not one I don't have a problem leaning into it a bit. I'm just not going to go jump off the deep end for it.
Would you say that koinonia and some koinonia were a metaphor from economics to describe, for example, carriers? I mean, I don't think you use the word metaphor. But would you use the word metaphor? Or would you not? That's my first question.
It's a great question.
I've got to follow up depending on your answer.
Yes. So I usually don't use metaphor, and here's why. I think that all of that stuff at the beginning, I don't think is metaphorical, right? Like if a goddess has her own bank account, like that's like there's a bank account there. Yeah. And I'm not saying there's like Aphrodite Pontia up in the sky, like doing stuff. But if you think with kind of like feminist materialist theorists, like that could still have a real effect on the economy to put the assets of a temple in a bank account, et cetera, right? So I want to push away, this is a problem in my own field in biblical studies. These texts have been metaphorized, like to an extreme, such that it is not taken seriously some of the kind of financial realities on the ground. So that's why I usually don't use metaphor.
On the question of gods and money, it's interesting that, of course, in mythology, gods don't have money. I mean, mythologies are pretty managed.
Yeah.
And in 5th century texts, with Thucydides talks about all the wealth in the Athenian treasury.
Yeah.
It's the Athenians' wealth. It's not the goddess' wealth. Aristophanes says the wealth which is with the goddess. And I suspect that you never actually cross a line in which these gods are envisaged as kind of disposing of money as an instrument of power, because they have power anyway. They have power. So yes, certainly the way of describing all that money is to say it's the account of Athena. I mean, that has several advantages, but I think there's probably, and I don't know about the Hellenistic period, but in the classical period, you simply don't have the idea of what's power. But as for metaphor, I mean, the fact is that the word koinonos and koinonia has more than just an economic sense.
Absolutely.
It has a religious sense.
Yep.
And certainly it can mean participation in sacrifice, and not just in the early period. I mean, and participation in the meal.
Yep.
This goes like you find it in Cultic and other later authors. So is that not relevant to your attitude to whether it's metaphorical or not? Because to be sure, if you have a word like bebiosis, which is a financial term, this looks like simply a transposition, if not a metaphor, transposition of economic vocabulary into the conception of Carey's art or whatever it was. But actually, surely one element in what is behind these texts is the fact that koinonia has a venerable tradition of religious sharing, which is why I kind of balked slightly at the translation shareholders. I mean, I know you're being a bit provocative, but it gets all the wrong associations, not all the wrong associations, but partly the wrong.
Yes.
It's a religious term as well.
Yes, absolutely. So, I for your first question, I would not. You obviously know a ton more about the classical period than I do. I do think that for me, it's not about whether. The issue is that money is how gods and humans often do business with one another. And I do think we have evidence once you get beyond the literary stuff to the material stuff, where you have inscriptions like this, where it goes in her bank account. And I think that obviously humans are bureaucratic functionaries are managing all that day-to-day stuff, right? So I know that people are also aware of that. But I do think that like Aphrodite Pontia is owning, gets her share of stuff, right? And of course, that's still run by the temple bureaucracy and by the ecclesia that's making decisions about construction costs, et cetera. All those things are absolutely right. But to even figure it in that way, I think is something of a statement, right? And then the koinonia stuff, absolutely, it has all of those full ranges. And it's great you bring up the sacrifice language. Paul talks about the stuff that Epaphroditus sends as he uses liturgia language. So he uses formal sacrificial language about some of the gift back and forth that is happening here. So I think there's multiple layers to this. What I'm finding in biblical scholarship is they're only, by that kind of metaphorization, they're only taking that one sense of koinonia language, koinon cognates. And I do think because really the main occasion of this letter is sending some stuff to a guy in prison and him saying, thank you, no thanks, I'm contributing anyway. I do think you have to also include the financial connotations there, which is why I think it's helpful here. It was a great question, so yeah.
In Judaism,
yes,
there's this idea, more than an idea, it's a practical reality, that the priests are supposed to act as expert appraisers.
Yes.
Do you see that in the literature? I
actually think that one inscription actually is kind of similar, like the accounting books seem to be done. This end of year inventory seems to kind of be like an appraisal of the value of what they got and then a redistribution kind of.
See that again?
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's a longer inscription here. I apologize for just the stuff, but
I can think of at least 2 tractates of Talmud.
If you do think of those, tell me, because I would love to. I keep trying to push this. One of the things I'm still working on is I think this is active later than than just here, and it's easier to find stuff from this particular stuff. So I would love the Talmudic references afterwards if you want.
I wanted to hear a little bit more about the sense in which Aphrodite or the gods own the temples, because I assume they can't sell them to somebody else.
Yeah.
So what's the concept of ownership exactly?
Yeah, so there's another great example. I didn't have time for it here, and oh gosh, I'm gonna forget what city it's in. But for some reason, it's during the reign of Augustus, some local small temple has gone into debt, and a local private person has bought the debt, right? So the deity is in hock to this person. And so there's a decree from Augustus that all of these things are supposed to be public, right? And so there's an inscription that records like, what are we supposed to do? This temple is in hock to, and this deity is in debt to this person, but these are all supposed to be public. And the local boule is basically supposed to cobble together enough funds to pay off the debt. And again, it's a literal reference, which the deity has. Make sure this person is paid the correct amount. So it's not always just the gods are giving beneficence from on high. Like, you could sometimes obligate the deities to yourself if your local temple was a little. So I think there's more examples that are kind of like this, like whose property is this? Is sometimes these contracts are doing the property work in the name of the deity. In Delphi, there's a ton of manumission inscriptions. So for enslaved persons, all of those manumission inscriptions, it's like, I think thousands of them, on the way up to up there in Delphi towards the Oracle, they are contracts. What are they set up as contracts? They're a contract that sells the enslaved person to the god Apollo. So the manumission of this enslaved person is actually a re-enslavement to the deity. Right? So yeah, that person is conditionally freed, still owes money, et cetera. Like, that's what they're doing day to day. But like, contractually, in stone on the wall, Apollo owns a lot of slaves, right? So I think this stuff is happening all over the place in a wide variety of types of interactions.
So would you be on board then with thinking about the gods as artificial persons creating the unity of these communities that are bound by the temple?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think so. While also saying that I think ancient persons take those seriously. Like,
Sure.
Yeah,
Right.
absolutely. Did you? Yeah.
So I'm wondering how much you think it makes sense to read quantifiable measures into some of these texts.
Yeah.
The last one you had, it's one thing to say, if you don't work, you don't get to eat.
Yeah.
Quite another to say, you've only done
Yes.
$50 worth.
Yes. Yeah. No. Oh, that's such a great question. And I think that's what, like, I really think that's what that Republican congressperson was doing, is like, oh, you have to do search for a job for 20 hours a week or you don't get your SNAP benefits. Certainly a lot of these associations have that level of measurement, right? If you're 2 months behind on your dues, you don't get to come, et cetera. You pay X whatever in fine if you don't do X, Y, or Z. I don't think we have enough data to say there what's going on. I've also been toying with the idea a little bit. I don't have it fully thought out. It's on an article I'm trying to work on, that who's most likely not to be working in the ancient world is rich people, like who actually doesn't work. And so I'm wondering if this is also potentially has a subtle jab towards people who could be contributing more, but are like, I don't need to show up to help sweep, or I don't need to pay more than whatever, or maybe I'm behind on dues, but I totally could pay my dues. And so like, I doubt this is about like individual laziness, and is much more about some kind of admonition about people who should be able to help take care of things, but maybe aren't. So I wonder if there's some kind of a critique of wealth in that passage sometimes. Yeah.
There's some good stuff in Aristotle where he
Yeah.
explicitly talks about measure, like.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. No, I that's what I'm saying is like, I think this passage is more likely invoking broader tropes about wealth and leisure and not working than about like so-and-so not paying in
Yeah.
5. Yeah.
So tiny follow-up.
Yeah.
Do you think the same sentiment could have occurred in a, as it were, a pre-monetary society?
Hmm.
You know, like in Homer or wherever.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah.
can expect to receive.
Yeah.
That's a different sort of thing than.
That's a great question. Most of my stuff is post-monetary society existing, but I do think even just the beginnings of quantification, you were talking about roof tiles yesterday. Roof tiles are also a big thing, and especially some of these lower wealth communities, when they're putting together to like put their stuff together, the donation inscription will not say so-and-so gave such and such. They'll say so-and-so and their sons brought 15 roof tiles, and so-and-so painted the fresco, and so-and-so, like when they can't contribute cash, they're contributing labor to these kinds of projects in ways. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just say that if you're looking for explicit quantification, it seems to be the obvious New Testament reference would be the parable of the talents. I actually just wonder, sort of, do you see a relationship between that and this kind of Pauline language?
Yeah.
As a business venture.
So the other big place, obviously, in the New Testament where this is all happening is in the parables. There's tons of like money changing hands and stuff. And the parable of the talents, where this like wealthy landowner hands out some stuff to some enslaved persons and goes away and then comes back, is a big, huge bit of it. And it's really messy, and scholars are not sure what to do with it. Because on the one hand, and this is what parables are. They're supposed to be deliberately enigmatic, right? But one option is, and this totally makes sense, within a system like this where you're getting your theology and stuff from a broader system, of course, God is an exploitative landowner who gives you some stuff and sure as heck expects a doubling of your investment of whatever stuff, and is going to punish you very violently if you don't return on investment. Like, that's ominous and a little scary, but totally within the possibility of range of reading that parable. There are other scholars, William Herzog, who like to read the parables as subversive, like who would say, actually, it's the third enslaved person who buries the money, who's like making a statement against the man, right? That like to refuse, that actually, no, money, it's not natural for money to reproduce, right? That also has a good philosophical tradition, right? So actually the other two are doing stuff that is not right or not good or like unnatural. And it's this third enslaved person who is like naming the unnaturalness of this wealthy exploitative landowner. Well, those are completely opposite readings, both of which are completely legible within the broader economic system. And that's the fun part about the parables.
It certainly seems like you could read it in this kind of
Absolutely.
Pauline language as if you don't invest properly.
Exactly. Yes.
You're not going to get the benefits of partnership.
Exactly. And I mean, that also could be read in exactly the way you said, and it also could be read in a nice way. Oh yeah, these folks who don't have enough are pooling their meager resources. Who does Paul turn to when he's in jail? The poorest Christ community. And they think they have a full access to divine abundance, even though they don't have a lot of material resources. You see, I can read either of these in both positive and negative directions. Yeah, Daniel.
You refer to people who don't pay dues or don't contribute what they should contribute. That's what's called in economics the free rider problem. And there's a theory of clubs, religious groups as clubs.
Yeah.
And one of their major problems is, as I said, to avoid the free rider problem.
Yeah.
So you're familiar with that literature already.
Yeah, a little bit, not as much for modern economic stuff, but it is echoing exactly don't pay in your dues for the last 6 months, you're totally out. It doesn't matter if you've been paying us for 20 years, you don't get your funeral, like those kinds of protection structures.
Someone who genuinely can't afford dues.
That's a lot of these setups do have things for people who can't afford dues, but you got to get in first. So,
Could be required to give labor.
yeah, exactly. And that's why you have some of these like, building projects record people doing labor. Yeah,
Can we go to the rich man in the eye of the needle?
absolutely.
In the biggest picture,
Yeah.
can we read this in the second quotation from Philippians?
Yeah.
I'll put everything that was
Yeah,
in the
yeah,
positives
yeah,
and
yes, yeah.
Can we, is it fair to read the fall and in almost the
Yes.
most of the Gospels anyway?
Yeah.
As critique of property and wealth and all that?
Yeah.
That this is really endangering your soul, this kind of just.
Yeah.
And everything.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
yeah,
I think the teaching of the, it's easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than a rich person to enter the kingdom is probably the clearest, least ambiguous anti-wealth critique that we have. And it's present in several of the gospel tradition. It probably is an authentic Jesus saying. So I do think it's quite likely that there is an anti-wealth, very strong vein through the Gospels and through Philippians here. And I think that makes sense because none of these people are wealthy by any of our measures of, no matter how we're doing the income scale for the ancient world. I do think that the problem starts to be with some of these parable traditions where like, why would someone who says that have the image of God as an exploitative landowner where you have to produce wealth to not get beaten up and thrown into the fires? Like that's where you start getting
unless wealth is purely metaphorical.
yes, unless wealth is purely, well, I will say very early on, Christians don't like that teaching about the camel in the eye of the needle. Yeah, because that might have implications for what you have to do. And so people metaphorize that, right? So there's actually a long and fake archaeological tradition that names a particular gate in Jerusalem as the like camel gate. And so this is some like, oh, it's saying like, it's really hard to squeeze in. So like, isn't it hard to like it with wealth? But you totally could, just like these people could go through this narrow gate where only one camel could fit at a time in Jerusalem. And it's like, I think an article just came out, it dates to like before the 14th century, this tradition of finding a nice little out for like, oh, you can't put a camel through the eye of a needle.
You're very sensitive to this gospel of wealth.
Yeah.
How do they get away with it? I'm serious.
Yeah. There's a lot of proof texting of completely other texts than this, right?
Yeah,
So you metaphorize away passages like that. And then what is the, I'm forgetting, it's in the Hebrew Bible, the like, and also that I have plans to prosper you and not to harm you, to give you land in a future. I think it's I'm sorry, I'm blanking, but there's this like nice verse that gets quoted by like everybody in the prosperity theology movement. So that's what the Bible does. You proof text them. Yeah.
My favorite example.
Yeah.
I think it's authentic, is the difference between Makarioi and Tokoi, that's with the poor.
Yes.
And Tokos is like very,
Very poor. Yes.
that's unambiguous. Then in the later version,
Yes.
Makarioi and Tokoi to pneumati.
Yes.
Poor in spirit.
Yes.
Aha, we got around it.
Yeah.
You can be as rich as Croesus and poor in spirit.
Yes.
So this starts very early.
Very early.
And
Yeah.
it's in Clement of Alexandria, I think,
Yes.
as well.
Yeah.
But could I just stand back and take some broad considerations arising out of Slowly's question?
Yeah.
Humanitarian societies, in which of course there is reciprocity between mortals and between mortals
Yes,
and gods.
yeah.
It's just not quantified. and
Yeah.
It's not absolutely obligatory.
Yeah.
But in Homer, there are virtually no temples.
Yeah.
But why not? Because temples in the ancient Near East and in Greece, I can't speak for the Jerusalem temple, but they are economic institutions, quite simply.
Yeah.
That's where you put the wealth. It's where you put all this gold and silver that's accumulating. Now, as I said earlier, this belongs to the community, and there's a big difference between, say, an Egyptian temple and a Greek temple. Egyptian temple is a central point of the mode of extracting surplus value from the peasantry. It goes to the priests and the pharaohs. Whereas the Greek temple, absolutely not. It belongs to the polis, it belongs to the community. The priests may have a role in administrating it, but they're appointed by their citizens, appointed by the polis. They're just state officials.
Yeah.
And this is very remarkable. And so why do you give the gold and silver to the god at all? Answer, for the same reason you put it in a strong building, security. Because if this belongs to the deity, then it's a worse crime to steal it.
Yes.
And this is the fundamental practical necessity. Same practical necessity as putting it in those very strong buildings. No buildings as strong as the Parthenon. There it is. Now, it may be that this kind of changes in the Hellenistic period, because in the Hellenistic period, the Greeks take over Egypt and Asia. I have no idea about that. But it'd be interesting.
No, that's really interesting. This is parallel, but I think just furthers the conversation. It goes to the quantification of some of this stuff. So in the chapter in my book, when I read this passage, I read two texts from Lucian, because he's great, because he's always making fun of everything. So you can kind of tell like what he's making fun of is telling you something. So on sacrifice, Lucian says the gods are cheaply bought for 12 drachma of chicken, they'll give you this much in blessings. And then it literally is an accounting list of like, if you do this, the gods will give you this. And it cites some of these Homeric traditions of like, oh yeah, it's really cheap to totally get out of Troy for this type of price, right? And then another text which is really interesting is, and it's less read, is Philosophies for Sale, which is a comparison of different philosophical ways of life that is set up as a slave market. And it is Zeus and Hermes auctioning off slaves, and each slave is a representative of a philosophy, right? So at one point, they actually auction off, I'm forgetting who it is now, and they discover that the slave has a thigh of gold and is a deity. And then he still gets sold off pretty cheaply for like 10 minas or something. And there's a whole little joke in there, right? So you're actually like selling off the deity as a way of talking about what it means to follow a way of life. Well, actually, I think that's very, minus the making fun of it, it's very similar to what's going on here. You're transacting in your semi-divine or divine figure. And setting up kind of price stuff, even if it's less explicit here than it is in Lucian. But you have exact price setting in Lucian all the time for that kind of stuff to make fun of it.
For that.
Yeah. Let me. Afterwards, I'll get it. I'm aware of time because I want to give.
Can I make this one?
Yeah, go for it.
This word kerdos.
Yeah.
Kerdos is a very negative word.
Yes.
Now, remember that an ancient economy was not a capitalist economy. I mean, of course, there is making money from money. Aristotle condemned it.
Yes.
It's a tiny part of the overall economic activity. Ancient economy is not a capitalist economy, and that's a big fact. The context of what you're talking about.
Yes.
I'm wondering whether there's any sense in which, when you say gain the profit rise, which of course they're not misunderstood by prosperity cost.
Yes.
But whether actually what's being said is, well, kerdos is disgusting, but Christ is the real, pure, non-disgusting.
Yeah.
Is that an idea?
Yeah, I think that's totally reasonable. And actually that fits in well with, I read this passage alongside, there's the famous price setting inscription in Pergamon for fish sellers and money changers. So the money changers in Pergamon are charging, like they charge a little to change your currency to the local currency. They are charging fish sellers extra because the fish sellers can also deal in some external currencies. So the fish sellers formally complain to the local government and then up to the emperor. And there actually comes like an imperial edict that you can get a little care day from your currency exchange transactions, but you can't exploitatively get a care day from your such that it causes Zamia, loss, the other word here. So both of those words show up in this inscription so that the money changers who cannot charge a different rate for other people who can transact in multiple currencies just because they can transact in multiple currencies. And there again, you have the play in that inscription, you have the play with both of these terms here. So I think you're absolutely right. There's some like, you know, you don't want to cause anyone xamia. Keratos isn't great. You can have an appropriate, but like modest, but yeah, it can get out of hand real quickly. So
Who was the unfortunate imperial bureaucrat who gets put in charge of dealing with
that,
fish regulations?
like the 5 fish sellers in Pergamon who are like, hey, they're charging us an extra 2% when we exchange our yeah, I know those things are amazing. How much bureaucracy there is. Okay, thank you all so much. That was a very good question.